You're listening to Queering Premodern Asia. This narrative series features discussions with queer Asian co-hosts and scholars that will have you questioning everything you thought you knew about queerness, love, and life in premodern Asia. I'm your host and producer Lazu. I'm a cis, straight, Chinese-American woman who spent the last 10 months or so researching and developing this series. I'm excited to be joined by my guest co-host for today's episode, Dr. Badie.
Hello, I am Badie, an Iranian, queer, bisexual, polyamorous, neurospicy, cisgender, femme professor and psychologist.
Content warning, this limited series explores historical contexts of love, gender, sexuality, and cultural norms. Exploration of those themes should not be deemed as an endorsement of those practices. It was a different time with different norms. This information is for entertainment purposes only. Mature themes may be explored. Some things that were normal then are definitely not now. Today's episode includes mention of suicide. Listener discretion is advised. For transcripts, show notes, and more ways to listen and support, go to nuancespod.com. You can also follow us on social media at nuancespod. Episode 4. Love, Marriage, and Their Casual Relationship. Love. An intense feeling of deep affection. Marriage. The legally or formally recognized union of two people as partners in a personal relationship. Note that this definition does not mention love, yet we have come to expect that love is part of this equation. So when did love become a key ingredient in our recipe for a successful marriage? Whether or not you live in the West, your ideas of marriage were likely shaped by Western media. From Disney movies to Hollywood rom-coms, the script has been pretty consistent. Fall in love, overcome setbacks, get married and live happily ever after. Finding your one true love is what adulting is all about. I was still a toddler when Disney told me that someday I will find the love of my life, and regardless of what anybody thinks of him, because it will be a him, we'll get married and live happily ever after. Strangely, that's exactly what happened. But while I wouldn't trade my marriage for anything, researching this series has helped me appreciate the nuances of love, marriage, and how their relationship to each other throughout history has been casual at best. Most importantly, when romance hooked up with marriage, it had enormous consequences on queer love. In the first few episodes, we heard a lot about how same-sex love and gender fluidity was acceptable and even common in pre-modern Asia. We've also seen how, although same-sex love stories were swoon-worthy enough to coin new terms in the Chinese language, one was still expected to marry someone from the opposite sex. Even Emperor Ai and his lover Dongxian had female spouses. These two ideas might seem contradictory, but they definitely were not at the time. Love was not a prerequisite for marriage. So when did love become a key ingredient in our recipe for a successful marriage? You might be surprised to learn that marrying for love did not become a thing in the West until the late 17th century. Yep, before marriage became the union of two individual lovebirds, it was an understanding between two flocks of birds. It was a political alliance, a consolidation of wealth, a way to determine children's legitimacy and inheritance rights, a source of economic stability. For farming families, marrying and having children was a way to increase the family labor force. Marriages weren't as much about the couple than they were about their families or clans. Marriage and procreation was a duty you had towards your family and your community at large. Personal fulfillment was not the top priority in most cases, although we'll see some exceptions in a bit. Who you married was usually arranged by your parents, possibly mediated through a matchmaker, and possibly with input from the entire extended family or clan. Love was not a prerequisite, not even by a long shot. In medieval times, while some cultures expect love to grow after marriage, in others, love was even seen as a threat to political and social order. Marrying for love could bring chaos to the kingdom if the prince or princess chose a lover that was not aligned with their parents' political goals and alliances. And if the prince loves his wife, what evil things might he do because he is blinded by love? Such were the concerns of the very same people who later gave us Disney fairy tales. And it was true in most of Asia as well. In many fictional stories throughout Asia, from China, Persia, India, and beyond, loving a woman was seen as a threat to society, a distraction from the king's duties. Women were depicted as downright dynasty destroyers. If you grew up in the Asian diaspora, except Southeast Asian, we'll see why in a minute, chances are arranged marriages are not too far off in your family's past. Growing up, I knew of many close relatives whose marriages were arranged through a matchmaker, including some aunts and uncles. In high school, I was surprised to find that several of my classmates were open to the idea as well. A classmate of mine once told me she didn't expect to marry for love. For her, marrying the man her parents chose for her was what she wanted to do when the time came. She was confident that her parents would choose someone who is a good match for her and someone she could learn to love. Refusing to honor that tradition would be heartbreaking for her family, and she didn't feel strongly enough about needing to marry for love to cause such disruptions. So what was it like when marriage and love were divorced from each other? In this episode, we'll look at a few examples of pre-modern Asian societies and what love and marriage looked like in those societies, and how that shaped views on queerness. According to Confucian teachings, marriage is a virtuous woman's duty. Spoiler alert, Confucius was pretty sexist. In China, arranged marriage was the norm until recently, and getting married and having kids was seen as your life's duty for both men and women, as explained by Professor Wu here.
In Ming and Qing society, we do not have the Western pattern of man and woman falling in love, then get married. That is not a Chinese pattern. The Chinese pattern is all marriage is arranged. Everyone thinks they grow up, they understand they have to get married. We don't have any spinster or anything because all marriage was arranged by their parents. And they never even met before. That is your duty for your life.
In episode 1, we saw how male-male love was so romanticized that love stories of emperors and their male lovers coined new terms in the Chinese language. But my ancestors were so sexist that they even thought that a man's love for a man was superior to a man's love for a woman.
Homosexuality, that is a typical case. If you read the traditional Chinese literature, we have a long history, long tradition, just make same-sex love so romantic. And for some period, for example, the Chunqiu spring and the autumn period, and also the Weijing Nanbeitao, southern north dynasties, and particularly the period very close to us, that is the Ming and Qing, people thought that is very romantic. They thought if a man go for a woman, people thought that is just lust. But if you go for the young man, they will say that is for love, for pure love. Do not have any purpose. They thought that is a blind love. Of course, that is for the upper class. They always thought that if you love a woman, you have some practical purpose. You want to have children, and you want to have some marriage connection with other family. So it involves a lot of social issues. But if you're falling in love to a young man, that's because you admire his beauty. And that's pure love. You don't have any purpose. You don't want to get a son or daughter or any social connection.
Man-loving men was common, but they would still get married. This wasn't to hide their homosexuality, though.
All these men, actually, mostly they were bisexual. But of course, there are still some men, they only love men. They don't have interest to women at all. They still get married. That's not because they want to cover up their identity, but because they know that is their life duty. They have to have children. Theoretically, the man is legal. It's fine.
It was completely legal for men to have lovers outside of marriage, male or female. Whether or not they loved their wife was irrelevant because they didn't marry for love. That's sad. But sometimes they did marry their male lovers. Let's go to Fujian province on the southeastern coast of China. We're in the Ming Dynasty. You're a young man, maybe in your 20s or 30s. You're in love with another man who is younger than you. Neither of you are particularly rich, but you're comfortable enough to be able to ask for his hand in marriage, or rather ask for his hand in a sworn brotherhood, which is the term they use for it. His family is quite excited at the prospect because that would mean a huge financial burden off their shoulders. So the two of you plan the wedding of your dreams. On the day of the wedding, the two of you sacrifice a carp, a rooster, a duck. Sounds romantic? Hold that thought. and that blood because you're gonna need it. You then tell each other your exact dates and times of birth. Smear some of that blood on each other's mouths. Yeah, there it is. And swear eternal loyalty to each other. Personally, I would have swapped the blood for wine, but to each their own, right? Anyway, once the ceremony's done, you all enjoy a feast that of course involve the carp, the rooster, and the duck. Since you're the older man in the relationship, your beau moves in with you and your parents. Your parents welcome him and treat him like their son-in-law. You live about 20 blissful years together, as blissful as it can be to have in-laws in the same house, that is. Throughout your time together, you take care of your beau's every need, just like you would for a wife. In fact, you might already have a wife and kids, but he is your one true love. Eventually, though, your beau also has to fulfill his duty to procreate, and your duty is to help him. As per Fujian customs, you help him find a wife and arrange their marriage. You might even pay for their wedding and help furnish their new abode. This is the part where his parents pat themselves on the back and think, that was a worthwhile investment. We don't know if you still see each other after you've fulfilled your filial duties, but it wouldn't be surprising if you did. I paint this scene partly from my conversation with Professor Tsun Tsun Wu from the University of Hong Kong and partly from other sources that I've gathered. In those sources, they said sometimes the male couple would be together for up to 20 years before the younger man goes on to marry. However, even after they were both married, the love story did not necessarily have to end.
According to the historical record, sometimes because they both get married, they still live together, but sometimes they were separated. And when separated, they feel very sad. Some people, they suicide. That's in the historical record, because they are used to live with their lovers. Of course, this is not all throughout China. That's only happened in Fujian.
For women in China, same-sex love was not nearly as celebrated as it was for men. And when it was celebrated in the late imperial Chinese literature and drama, it was only in the context of polygamous marriage. The women's love was trivialized as a way to maintain harmony in the household between multiple wives, for example. In episode 2, the happy ending for Li Yu's play The Fragrant Companion involved both women marrying the same man and living in a threesome happily ever after. There was no way two women in love could be together outside the traditional marriage structure. So if female-female desire wasn't necessarily taboo, marriage resistance was. To complicate matters, ever since the Ming Dynasty, there was a huge gender imbalance, and there were way more men than there were women. Given that marriage was seen as a duty and was arranged by your parents, this meant that every woman was guaranteed to be married off unless they were a nun, a prostitute, or a marriage resistor. Remember the Golden Orchid Societies from episode 2? They were part of a marriage resistance movement. So because women were in high demand and short supply, in the following Qing Dynasty, legal reforms in the 18th century banned prostitution and extended expectations of marriage and chastity to all women. This sounds oddly similar to Republicans banning abortion to solve the aging population crisis in the US, despite immigration being a more humane solution, but I digress. Back to the Golden Orchid Societies. Remember these marriage resistors? They were badasses who earned their own dough and didn't want a man to tell them what to do. They lived in small women-only communes and pooled their resources together. Some of them were lesbians and married each other, but some of them may have been aromantic or asexual as well, or had other reasons not to want to marry. But now there was this legal pressure to marry. Would that stop them? Oh, hell no. So what did they do? They married ghosts. Yup, you heard me right. They married ghosts. Their parents would arrange a marriage for them with a family of a single gentleman who had already died. In those times, the bride's family had to pay a dowry to the groom's family. So it was a win-win. And apparently these ghosts were in high demand. Every time a ghost would become available, multiple women would be vying to marry him. In Iran too, until modern times, marriage was not about love, but about families coming together. If you recall, in episode 2, we heard from Nilufar Rasuli how women in Iran were dehumanized against love by the 19th century version of Karens blogging about their time spent with Iranian women, who they described as incapable of love.
So in the sense that even a straight woman is written to be incapable of understanding love, so how come in the colonial archives we can't find any trace of the practice of intimacy of women together?
Because by that point, Western love was predominantly about romance. But what about other forms of love?
As a way of responding to the way that Western missionaries, travelers, rulers, spies, they were writing the Oriental incapable of love. That kind of love that the project of modernization was trying to push was again a Western heteronormative way of love. The word love in the writing of women that I've been reading was not appearing as a love practice, as an intimacy between two bodies, but there are so many examples of seeing the word hubb, which is an Arabic word that is very also used in Farsi. Hubb, hubb vatan, the love to your country, the love to nation, the love to liberty. And this is something that the colonizing rhetorics will totally erase, and it will never write about it. This is a kind of love that will never fall into the Western defined way of thinking about love, right? For that, love is only a thing that is practiced with two, or maybe now, since the West is so progressive, more than two people, right? But at least in the so-called Middle East, it is a bit difficult to differentiate the hubb for watan, for the homeland, and the hubb for ard, for the land, and the hubb for the mother, and the hubb for the beloved, and the hubb for the tahrir, for the liberation. These are different kinds of hubb, but all of them are also love. This is what I wanted to mention, that when I say that in writings of women there's no hubb or ishq in the way of this heteronormative or Western, there's not like that, but there are so many times that I have seen the word ishq or hubb to liberty, to liberation, and to protecting the dignity of people against colonial troops inside the country.
By that time, the European understanding of love was tied to romantic love, love of God, love of one's country. It shouldn't have been much of a stretch to understand it in the Persian context as well, but alas, Orientalism. It was much easier to focus on what was lacking, romantic love in the way that is understood in the West, as proof that the West was more liberated and therefore should be emulated. Iran was not the only place where the meaning of love came to change. In Korea, through the 1900s, love became associated with Christianity and patriotism. It had little to do with sexual or romantic desires. Kwon Bodure explains that love can be translated as yone or sarang. I'm sorry if I pronounce things wrong. Yone connotes love between a man and a woman, while sarang was associated with the love of God and nation. The term yone first appeared in connection to romantic love in the serial novel The Tears of Twin Jade. This novel was published in the Daily News in 1912 to 1913 with the catchphrase, "I could teach you that the yone of young men and women is an extremely sacred thing." After the occupation of Korea by Japan in 1910 and a failed independence movement in 1919, educational and cultural reform was in the public zeitgeist, along with discussions of yone and its connections to romantic love. But it was already linked to patriotism and nation building. Literature from the time emphasized spiritual love and virginity over carnal desire, and this was highly influenced by Japanese translations of Western works. While Iranian women were dehumanized by Karens and Chads, in case you don't know, Chads are the male version of Karens. In the case of Korea, women were dehumanized against love even by Korean men. In the 1920s, the New Women's Movement became an organized women's protest against the Confucian patriarchy. Kim Tong-in, a male writer of the time, wrote in his Story of Kim Yon-sil, likely based on a famous new woman named Kim Myung-sun. He writes, "The love she comprehends is nothing but intercourse. Literature is love, and love cannot be separated from intercourse." She learned this idea of love from Ellen Key and Kurigawa Hakusan. Kim Yoon-sil was born in Korea and does not know what yone means. What he's saying here is that the new women are imitating the version of love that they learned from the Japanese and the Europeans, but they don't really understand what love really is. They don't understand the spiritual experience that's supposed to come with it or the civilizing nature of it. In the colonial era, Confucianism was criticized. On one hand, the discourse around love championed by Christian activists was to liberate women. Ironic, if you ask me. On the other hand, the discourse around love reinforced the existing hierarchy where women were subordinate to men. That sounds more like Christian activists. During the Korea period, 918 to 1392 current era, marriages were made primarily on the basis of political and economic considerations, at least for the noble class. Marriages were often arranged by matchmakers too, but unlike China at the time, the couple would move in with the wife's family. The spouses would each still be part of their parents' clans, and there was no dowry or bride wealth. If you don't know, bride wealth is the opposite. Dowry is when the bride's family pays the groom's family, and bride wealth is when the groom's family pays the bride's family. So there was no dowry or bride wealth in that period. Sons and daughters received equal inheritance shares from their parents. Men could have multiple wives, but there was no hierarchy among wives or offspring, and either spouse could easily divorce. During the Joseon era, 1392 to 1910, a lot of the laws and customs of Ming China made its way to Korea. There was now primary versus secondary wives, and more strict rules about the line of succession. Primary wives could not be divorced for another, and wife rankings could not be changed either. Couples also started to move in with the husband's family instead. Dang. To all my Korean listeners, I'm very sorry that my ancestors made your country more misogynist. If you've watched a few K-dramas, you'll know that at least for the rich, marriage is still more of an economic power move than a romantic love story. When I first started watching K-dramas, that was very striking to me. But now knowing the history of marriage in the region, it kind of makes more sense. I now see where that comes from. In ancient Japan, women and femininity were highly regarded.
Ancient Japan was leaning towards kind of matrilineal society, bilineal society, in which properties were handed down from the mother to the daughter or aunt to niece. Women were regarded with more respect than later time period.
During the Heian period, 794 to 1185 current era, children of both sexes could inherit property, and husbands and wives disposed of their property independently. Men could have multiple wives, but women could only have one spouse. For reasons that are unclear to historians, the status of women rapidly deteriorated from the 14th century onwards. In the medieval and Edo periods, the purpose of marriage was to form alliances between families, to relieve the family of its female dependence, to perpetuate the family line, and especially for the lower class, to add members to the family's workforce. The 17th century treatise Greater Learning for Women instructed wives to honor their parents-in-law before their own parents and to be courteous, humble, and conciliatory towards their husbands. Husbands were also encouraged to place the needs of their parents and children before those of their wives. One British observer remarked, "If you love your wife, you spoil your mother's servant." The tension between a housewife and her mother-in-law has been a feature of Japanese drama ever since. Emotional attachment was considered inconsistent with filial piety. A proverb said, "Those who come together in passion stay together in tears." So it's interesting that at the time, marrying for love sounded like a recipe for disaster and unhappiness. But the very terms used to describe love changed over time too. In Edo literature, the nature of love was expressed with different words like iro, like eros, or koi, for attraction or passion, and jo, sentiment or emotion. But when sexual relationships were described, iro was most commonly used. In the late Meiji period, the words I and ran-I began to replace iro in literature when referring to romance between lovers that went beyond the sexual. When the purely spiritual aspect of the relationship was emphasized, the English term rabu for love was used in katakana. Japanese writers after 1885 used this modern concept of love to radically transform the relationship between men and women by promoting a spiritual form of love and repressing carnal desires or sexual acts in their writings. Before modern times, Japanese culture was much more sex positive. For men, sexual gratification was seen as separate from conjugal relations with their wife. The purpose of that was just procreation. Concubines and prostitutes were common, it was public, it was relatively respectable, until social upheaval during the Meiji Restoration put an end to feudal society in Japan. As with other societies, modernity came with new definitions of love, and the new definitions of love brought new boundaries for attitudes towards sex. And that's where we can trace the progression of the Korean understanding of love as well. I think one assumption we all have is that women had less agency in pre-modern times throughout the world. And that's not quite as universal as we might think. In Southeast Asia, things looked quite different from the patriarchal China, for example. Even prehistoric artifacts from Vietnam show that Vietnamese people didn't view sex as a lowly instinct that needed to be kept hidden. Instead, it was seen as a natural, wholesome human activity among many others that is in harmony with the universe. In fact, up to 1945, many villages had local festivals that included sexual games and rituals, even as Confucianism and Buddhism ordered restraint. And despite the Chinese influence, it seems like women in Vietnamese society had a lot more agency than their Chinese counterparts. In Ha Bac province, in Quang Lam commune, one such festival involved young men and women singing to each other to express their love. After the festival, the couple who sang to each other could marry if they wanted. If a girl became pregnant during the festival, she earned the right to marry any young man she wished. In Phu Liu village in Tu San district of the same province, the annual village festival includes young men and women throwing lit firecrackers at each other. Afterwards, the couples find a quiet place to express their love for each other. Many married women also participated in this custom with young men, and their husbands could not forbid them from doing so. Being married did not prevent them from being in love and expressing love for other men. In the 15th century, during the Li dynasty, the law allowed women to divorce their husbands if they did not perform their marital obligations. If they had children, then the husband had 12 months to perform his duty. Unlike Chinese women of that era, Vietnamese women had a lot more agency. Vietnam received heavy Chinese influence from the north and more Indian and Southeast Asian influences in the central and southern regions. But while Confucianism flourished during the 15th to 18th centuries and informed the laws of the land at the time, its philosophies were only popular among the elite. Research shows that common people living in villages had very rich, diverse attitudes towards marriage, love, and sex. Arranged marriages still existed, especially among the rich. Once they reached puberty, the rich kids' parents would arrange for them to get married as soon as possible to prevent premarital sex and potentially illegitimate children. However, in several areas of Southeast Asia, Anthony Reid notes that a woman's virginity factored into marriage, but not as an asset. It was an impediment. Men preferred to have an experienced wife rather than one without experience. In pre-modern Southeast Asia, women held important economic and diplomatic roles in society, and literacy rate among men and women was more equal compared to other parts of Asia. In fact, women dominated trade in Cambodia, Thailand, Myanmar, Vietnam, Indonesia, and Malaysia. One European account mentions a formidable woman trader from Vietnam. The writer says even though she traveled with a male companion, the woman did all the talking, and he just listened and agreed. Isn't that refreshing? Unlike the dowry system in India, China, and Japan, where the parents of the bride had to pay the groom, in Southeast Asia, it's the parents of the groom who had to pay the bride wealth in exchange for the bride. Marriage seemed to be more egalitarian and even shocked the Europeans who wrote about them in the 1600s. Divorce was common and there was no stigma attached to it. Women in their 20s being on their fourth husband didn't make anyone blink an eye. Children and property were divided without much drama. Indonesia and Malaysia, predominantly Muslim societies, had up to 50% divorce rate up to the 1960s. In Cambodia, if a man was away for more than 10 days, his wife could say she can't sleep by herself for that long because she's not a spirit. In the Philippines, there were also creative games played between young men and women, which involved asking and answering sexual questions. And afterwards, they were presented with the opportunity to have sex with each other. In the Philippines, marriages were monogamous even before Europeans had settled. Even the Spaniards, who looked down on the Filipinos in every way, had to admit that the couples were remarkably faithful and affectionate towards each other. So perhaps the love revolution started in Southeast Asia first? So we know that there can be marriage without love, as per the many stories so far about how marriage was about political and economic alliances of families. But could there be love and family without marriage? I'm not talking about unmarried couples, but a society in which the institution of marriage doesn't exist. Can there be love without the institution of marriage? Well, yes. In China, the Mo Suo people are an ethnic group living in Yunnan and Sichuan province. They are a matrilineal society to this day and did not have marriage per se until the 17th century Qing reforms that imposed requirements on inheritance from fathers, and legitimacy became more narrowly defined. Even today, marriage is a secondary option. In Mo Suo society, they have what is dubbed as walking marriages. The couples do not move in together. Instead, each partner works and eats in their own mother's household. When a man visits a woman and stays overnight, he leaves the next day. There's no ceremony or gift or social recognition of their relationship. Their relationship does not affect either partner's socioeconomic status, and they do not have to commit to an exclusive or long-term relationship. Any children born belong to the household in which they were born, usually the mother's. This household would include the woman's siblings, her mother and mother's siblings, and the grandmother. The woman's brothers, rather than the biological father, are the father figures in the children's lives. Although there are 3 classes in this society, walking marriages are class blind. There are still about 40,000 Mo Suo people today, and most of them maintain this practice. According to Stephanie Kuntz in her book Marriage, a History, this is the only society that has been studied worldwide that does not rely on the institution of marriage. So, what happened? How did love and marriage hook up? It wasn't until the 17th century that love marriages became more common in the West. Capitalism and wage labor made it possible for young people to earn their own money and therefore not rely on their parents for housing, jobs, dowries. Alongside that, new secular ideas from the Enlightenment period promoted individual rights, the pursuit of happiness, and so marrying for love instead of wealth or status became new ideals. By the late 18th century, personal choice had replaced parental choice, and people were encouraged to marry for love. Marriage became a private relationship between 2 people rather than one link in a large system of political and economic alliances. But when love was tied down in matrimony, at what cost was it? At the time, Europe was already predominantly Christian, and anything other than heteronormative love was shunned. Marriage was between a man and a woman, and it was the only institution in which one could practice love and sex freely. As Europe continued its colonial projects across the globe, it brought along its best weapons of mass westernization, Christianity and modernity. With that modernity came modern love and marriage. What happens when this narrow definition of love and marriage is imposed on such a wide array of cultures, many of which were conducive to same-sex love and polyamory? In a minute, I will bring back our co-host Manijay to discuss these stories. But first, I want to say thank you for being here. If you've made it this far into this episode, thank you for taking the time out of your day to be curious about these stories. It really means a lot to me as the creator of this series, but also to the queer Asian community whose stories aren't often heard. I've received some lovely messages from listeners lately, and it always just makes my day. If you would also like to make my day, let me know how you're enjoying the podcast. If there's any particular stories from this episode that struck you or resonated with you, let me know. I know it made me question a lot of assumptions I had about Southeast Asia, for example. If you'd like to share your thoughts, feel free to comment on the Instagram post for this episode or write in a review on Apple Podcasts, Good Pods, Podchaser, or Spotify. I'll put a link to do that in the show notes. I asked Manoj to be the guest today because so many of the stories in this episode involve polygamy or at least non-monogamy. Being a bisexual and polyamorous therapist, I thought she would bring a very interesting perspective to the conversation. Quick distinction between polygamy and polyamory. Polygamy is when you can marry multiple people. That's illegal in the US. But polyamory is when you have multiple intimate partners. If you are monogamous like me and feel slightly uncomfortable at the idea of polyamory, I challenge you to listen to the end of this episode because just like listening to a podcast about gay men doesn't make you gay, listening to this poly episode does not make you poly. She also gives really great communication advice that applies to monogamy as well as poly relationships. Now let's welcome back our guest co-host, Dr. Manoj Badie. Thank you, Manoj, so much for taking the time to co-host this episode with me.
Thank you. I'm so excited to be here.
So I shared the script with you. I'd love to know what you thought as you were reading through. What came to mind? What was your reaction? Was it surprising? Did you know a lot of this stuff? Tell me.
Well, it was very surprising. I did not know these at all, and it's prompted a lot of self-exploration for me because I haven't read a lot of queer histories. It was very delightful to read about how queerness was expressed in these sometimes very public ways. And so it was very beautiful to read that, and also the non-monogamy aspects of it, how that was sort of normalized into the society to some extent. And so that was really amazing to read.
Yeah, so do you want to go into some of the sections? I know you have notes, so let's go through your notes.
Yes, definitely. You know, I was really struck reading about a collection of societies being like this, because I think there's echoes of this today, which was China, Persia, India. This idea that there was room for multiple loves sometimes, but that specifically loving a woman was a threat to society, and it was a distraction from like manly duties. So that was, just
not great.
Yeah. But it also struck me as like one of the reasons people, I think, have such a strong reaction to polyamory, because in the contemporary form, a lot of us practice it in a very egalitarian way where women, femmes, have access to partners also. And I honestly think that's a big reason people have such a strong reaction to it, because I feel like for men, and masculine folk, it's been more considered acceptable. So that was really striking, because I was like, you kind of see that today. But I also really liked how in China there were bi men just publicly existing. That was so amazing too, Like I feel like as a bisexual, even within queer history, sometimes we're pretty much erased, or not seen as part of this history. So I love that you talked about that. I love that there were bisexual men also that were practicing their bisexuality in these different ways. So that was really interesting.
Yeah, it seems like bisexuality was actually the norm, especially among men. I mean, we talked about this in episode 2. We don't know as much about women, but probably there too. But documented about men. The emperors all had male lovers. They're literally in the history records. In China, Vietnam, Korea, bisexuality was the norm. And part of it too was it was not an identity. It was just something you did. Just because they had sex with men didn't make them a different kind of man. Mm-hmm. With a caveat that there was a class hierarchy usually involved, and who was the active versus passive male lover. But yeah, it was very normal.
That is so interesting. I think about it with gender today and just being out in queerness, because what research has shown is that if people find out that a man has slept with other men, that immediately calls into question his heterosexuality. Whereas if women date women or have sex with women, their queerness is dismissed. I don't know, it's probably also because our notion of masculinity is so narrow, right? Like it does change your identity, like you were saying, like identity versus practice, right? But I think we think about that today in these gendered ways as well.
Yeah, for sure. And that is a remnant of the history as well, right? In history, female love has been erased throughout time, has been trivialized, as we talked about in the episode. Even the plays that had lesbian characters are like, well, they're lesbian, yeah, but, they both want to be with the same man too, right? there's always a man involved. So what we're seeing today has inherited all of that history.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, that's such a good point. Yeah, I think it's all tied together, like that erasure of femme queerness. Absolutely.
Yeah. What did you think about the other sections? Did you have any notes?
Yes. So Fujian, I love that the families accepted their queer lovers as part of the family. I thought that was really just a beautiful thing. It's so mind-blowing because I feel like you just don't hear about that at all as a queer person, especially when I grew up, in the 80s and 90s, just don't really hear about that. So it was really beautiful to read that. Also tinged with sadness because when they sometimes separate, like if they were together, but then one of them had to fulfill their duty to, marry a woman and have children, and sometimes they would understandably become very grief-stricken. And so that was sad, but it was also beautiful to read that there was this very loving acceptance of queer partners. So overall, I thought that was really beautiful. And the fact that, like you said, the love stories sometimes didn't end. Sometimes they would still continue. So that was pretty amazing as well.
Yeah, I was shocked when I learned that this was a thing. In episode 2, we also talked about the women who were able to get married as well. Personally, I love the Golden Orchid Society part because they're like, okay, I'm going to have to marry a man. How about a ghost? I'm like, that is problem solving. I like it.
I know. And I love that you were like, when a ghost becomes available, everyone's like, I want that the hot commodity ghost. But it's so clever, right? I just think about our survival strategies, especially as femmes, women, like so clever over time. Feminists, we always find ways to persevere and find these clever strategies. So yeah, the ghost, that's so awesome. I feel like that by itself should be like a whole book or something.
Yeah. You mentioned not having access to those stories growing up in the 80s and 90s. Do you want to share a little bit where you grew up, what that was like? When did you figure out you were queer? Did you even have the words for that? Like, tell me.
I grew up in Texas, was born in 1980. So I grew up in the 80s. I was born in Iran and we lived in Germany for a little bit and then moved to the US permanently and spent all of my childhood, adolescence, and early 20s in Texas pretty much. I think I had maybe a sense, like, I remember as like when I was 17 saying that I was attracted to girls, but I feel like I knew it before then. I just didn't really have the language for it. And at the time, there was no representation of queer folk. This was way before Ellen. It was such a big deal in the late 90s when Ellen came out on her original sitcom. And that was such a big deal. And like she got fired at the time. But that was the first example of queerness that I had, and now I know that there were these spots of it that I didn't have access to because I also was an immigrant. A lot of cultural things about queerness that people grow up with here that they relate to in terms of media, I didn't have access to as a first generation immigrant. It was so invisible. It was just so invisible. Queerness was just not talked about. It was just very invisible. I remember I had a little bit of a crush on my friend and my mom sensed it. And I think it was very negative, a negative response. And just in general, I think, within Iranian, I think it just tends to be conservative. So it was just very invisible. Until I was in early adulthood, and there was more queer visibility at that time, I was able to be more out about my queerness and be more comfortable with it. But I don't remember any portrayals of queerness growing up.
Yeah. You also didn't know anybody else, like among your friend groups or anybody that you could talk to about it?
I do vaguely remember there was one student who had 2 moms, but I guess I didn't ask about, like, just to give you an idea of where I grew up, it's called Plano, a suburb. The teacher said one time, I'm not going to talk about abortion because it is too controversial, but I am going to talk about gay marriage and why that's wrong. So that was from a high school teacher that I had. And this also advanced program. I was in the International Baccalaureate program. This was one of the teachers in the International Baccalaureate program that was talking about this, so I'm sure there was other hidden messages, but even 8-9 years later, when my brother and sister grew up, there were queer people at their school that were out about being queer. But for me, other than like the mom of that one student, I didn't have any queer friends, didn't know any queer people.
Yeah, that must have been very lonely. So when you did finally understand that you were bisexual, did you tell your family right away, or how did that work out?
Not right away, no. I mean, it took me probably a few years to come to terms with it. Actually, but I think right away I did tell people that I really cared about and I felt safe with. So I didn't tell my family, but I did tell, loved ones, friends that I trusted. So I did come out in that sense. Even when I was 17, I acknowledged it out loud to people. But to my family, I didn't come out until, my mom, like mid-20s, I think, and my dad, like in my 30s. And then my grandpa, I've told him. Those were the only people that I felt like I have to tell in person. Everybody else, it's fine if they find out via social media, because I have the most closest with them that I feel like they are the ones that I feel responsible for telling. And my siblings I told well before that. But my parents, it took a long time. It took a really long time. And then it took another long time for me to be able to be out on social media, because my mom did not want me to be out on social media. As an immigrant, I center her perspective so much. And so I didn't come out for a long time. But now I'm like, well, I tried it your way and it didn't work.
Yeah. Have they made their peace with it now?
So my dad was so great about it, actually. So I told both of them about being bisexual and polyamorous at the same time. And my dad was like, I love that you choose your own relationships. And he was actually very affirming and very proud. And I was like, oh, I should have told you sooner.
Oh, that's so sweet.
Yeah, it was really cool. And my grandpa too. My grandpa didn't make a big deal about it. He was very, very kind. But my dad's reaction, just to hear him say, like, I'm proud of you, and he's always just been such a role model to me. And it was just really so beautiful. It was one of the best responses you can get for coming out. And he's like, I'm just so glad you told me. With my mom and other members of my family, they kind of accept it, but they would prefer that I wouldn't talk about it. In Iranian culture, and actually in US culture too, because they've studied this, people prefer people who are cheating. They think that's more moral and ethical than somebody who is polyamorous and not lying about it and having multiple relationships. Like, for some reason,
Wow.
That's considered more ethical in people's minds. Yeah, thinking about the stories that you presented in these histories, it's really interesting how certain things are hidden, right? And certain things are public. And so, like, I think in Iranian culture, it's like, you don't talk about it. Like, so yeah, maybe that's okay, but just keep it kind of behind closed doors. Sometimes that perspective is there. There's this acceptance of me as a person, but maybe a slight preference for me not to be so out about it. But I think we have a good balance where it's like, okay, like, we don't necessarily have to agree on this. So we can just agree to disagree, and it doesn't have to stop me from living my truth. And it's okay if you don't like it, but maybe just vent to friends about it. It's not something that I should center necessarily, if that makes sense.
Yeah. I don't know if it's the same in Iranian culture, but in Chinese culture, I think one of the things that makes it complicated is, let's say I came out as queer. I think my mom would feel like that reflects on her. Whatever judgment the community has is not just on me as a person, but on my parents, on my family, on my entire community. And so I think there's a pressure for her to preserve the honor of, the family, or whatever that means. I wonder if that's also part of Iranian culture as well. I know it's very prominent in Chinese culture.
Absolutely, absolutely. This idea that, yeah, you're a reflection, and just the collectivism, this is not just about you, it is about your community. And honestly, I love that. I love that value, and I hold that value, although I think I'm still affected by, American values as well. But I do try to hold that value, always consider my family and consider my community. And that's why I think it was so hard to come out, because I think if it were just about me, then, okay, it's just me. Like, I'm the only one that is going to be affected, right? And actually, they've done research on this too, where it's more beneficial for white people to be out than people of color sometimes, because you get certain benefits, whereas people of color sometimes lose things, especially like ties to your community, which maybe have been a big part of your survival, and a big part of your values in your life. So that did really take me a long time to grapple with. I was like, it's not just about me. I can't just look at it as about me. Maybe me being out is like, am I doing it in this very Western way that reflects, a different value system? And I grappled with it for a long time. And what I ultimately came to realize, though, is that Iranian queer people are also my people. Just like I don't center privileged groups, like I don't center white people when I talk about racism, for example. I'm not going to center necessarily straight Iranian people when I'm talking to queer people. Like I'm talking to Iranian people that are queer, which percentage-wise, there's more people in Iran that are identified as queer than here. I think it's a little over 10%. There's a lot of people that are Iranian queer. So I ultimately came to the conclusion that, yes, I can still center family and I can still center my community, but I can't necessarily center every community at once, right? So for this, if I'm talking about queer stuff, I'm going to be centering Iranian queer people, not heterosexual Iranian people. So therefore, I feel like I'm still being oriented towards my community, but in a way that feels ethical and consistent with like power dynamics that I want to challenge.
Yeah, that's such a great point. Your community is not just straight people, Why not speak to the most marginalized in your community to begin with?
Yeah, exactly. Because how are things going to change unless we bring those voices forth that have historically been silenced, that are still silenced very much so, So that's such a part of my values.
Yeah.
The Iranian one, of course, I have to comment on that one. I love the idea of love. This was talked about in the previous episode as well. This idea of love, how it sort of applied to all these things, right? It was very expansive and it wasn't necessarily confined to a specific parameter or something like that. So I loved that, I love that it extends to the land and your beloved and liberation. And I just thought that was really beautiful. And it's funny because there is a recent book that just came out in polyamory. It's called What is Compersion by Dr. Marie Tuan. And basically compersion in polyamory just means that you're happy that your partner's with someone else. It's like the joy you feel when your partner's with someone else. So in her research, in this recent book, what she's found is that one form of compersion that came out is that joy you feel, but also in other contexts, non-romantic contexts. So that joy you feel when your friend accomplishes something great, and how we don't have the language for that, right? So it was really beautiful to read this and be like, oh, my people did have this language for it, that was so broad, because we confine it and we compartmentalize it, right? But ultimately, there's such joy and so many things and love in so many things. So I thought that was really cool and tied into some recent work that was interesting.
Yeah.
And same thing with the Japanese notions too. I thought the idea of the love and the expansion, the different forms of love was very, very beautiful. I really was so delighted to read about Vietnam. And it's really so amazing that there was throughout time these consistently progressive attitudes about gender. 15th century, 18th century, like women had agency. And I love that local festival where they sing to each other. And then if she gets pregnant, she can choose. So it's like,
I know.
That's so cool.
I'm like, wait, so does the guy get to say no if he doesn't want to?
It would be kind of a good reparations, right? If he can't. Just kidding. Yeah. That was just so cool. And because also there's this book called Sex at Dawn that talks about how after agriculture basically is when monogamy was imposed, because it became really important to have people to work with you in the agriculture. Ownership became really important. When I was reading this, and it was saying it was happening up to 1945, that they were doing this where it didn't matter necessarily who's the father, that she still gets to choose, and that this was happening in 1945.
Well, I don't know if that particular practice went all the way to 1945, but up to 1945, there were those local festivals. I don't know when they dropped certain aspects of it. These are just a few of the festivals that they had in Vietnam. There were a whole bunch more in the paper, but I want to focus specifically on the ones that were relevant to marriage and polyamory. And, the other one where even married women can just go declare their love for a younger man, and their husband was like, okay, sure, whatever. And that was fine. It was like, okay, that is very different.
Yeah, definitely. Definitely. That was so cool. And just throughout Southeast Asia, it was just such an amazing history. Like, I want to read a history just about those countries, how it was so egalitarian by so many standards. You just think, oh, it doesn't have to be like this. It's like, wow, we take so many of these things for granted, but it's just really amazing to read these. So yeah, I really appreciate you sharing these with me because it's set me on a whole journey, and yeah, it's really amazing.
Oh, thank you. Well, I'm glad. That's the whole point of the series is to bring those stories that we didn't even know were around. I was very surprised when I looked into Southeast Asia because I started my research doing a lot more reading on China, partly because there's a lot more available in English about China. So I expected that most of Asia would be kind of similar to China and India. I was very surprised to find that Southeast Asia had a very different attitude towards like everything. I mean, China was very patriarchal for a long, long, long time. And yeah, I hate that my ancestors went and spread all this patriarchal bullshit everywhere.
Yeah.
I mean, the West definitely helped, but they were
I mean,
there
that
first.
was so many societies, I feel like, but I hear you. Yeah. I mean, I hear you. You're like, oh, why'd you spread it?
Yeah, why'd you spread that part?
Yeah, that's also why it is so awesome to read these histories. You get a different side, right? Because, well, at least with Iranian, I feel like there's a lot of negative aspects that people think of now with the way the government is. There's so much trauma in the population that there's lots of difficult aspects to it. But then you read these stories and it's like you see a time where just things were more expansive and loving. So it just makes these stories even more important. I feel like people should make a children's book. I don't even know, but I think kids should really have access to this information because I can't even imagine what my childhood would have been like if I had access to these stories then. Like, I probably would have realized myself sooner. I would have had so much less shame. I would have had more pride in myself at a much younger age. And so, yeah, these are just really, really important stories.
Yeah.
And we don't have to compartmentalize love so much. I think that's also what I took away. We compartmentalize love so much, like romantic and then everything else, right? It wasn't always like that. That was another takeaway for me. There were these spiritual and all these different ways of love, and it didn't have to be so divided and so specific. So
yeah, I'm curious, when did you realize that you wanted to be polyamorous?
well, it's not about wanting to be polyamorous. It's just that I always have been polyamorous, I think. Before I had the words for it, I never was able to fit into monogamy. The specific rules of monogamy, I really tried to fit into those rules and I wasn't able to do that because I was still sometimes attracted to other people. Sometimes I would be at a party and I felt like I would have fun with this person, we would make out or something, and then my partner would just think everything about the relationship changed and I was just, completely different person. Our relationship, everything was called into question. And I always was very honest. I never lied about anything. I always told the person right away, but I felt confused because I didn't think it changed my feelings for that person. But it seemed like for that person, it really changed how they saw me and saw my feelings. So I never really fit into it, but I didn't have the words for it until I think it was 2009 when I came across, it was like a blog. Salon was doing a series on non-monogamy, and it was specifically from a woman who was non-monogamous, and it just clicked a light bulb for me because she was really owning her sexuality. She was owning her non-monogamy and proud of it. And she's like, it never worked for me. And I'm like, oh my gosh, that's me. Like, there's something else I could be. And I had basically told myself, well, I'm just going to not be in a relationship. That's okay. I like being alone. I like my own company. So that's all right. But then when I found that, I was like, oh, I can't be in a relationship, but I can do it in this way that is authentic for me and is consistent for me. I started identifying as non-monogamous like 2009, 2011, I would say, was when I really became polyamorous, which is allowing multiple emotional commitments as well. So like non-monogamy is like a big umbrella of different things that just aren't monogamous. But polyamorous is the type of non-monogamy where you allow multiple love relationships, multiple commitments. And that really just was consistent with my values. It's more egalitarian generally how it's practiced, or that's how I practiced it.
What do you mean by that? That is more egalitarian?
I mean, not everybody practices it this way. So I should give a caveat, because I always think with language, we defer to how someone defines it for themselves. But generally, the way that I think polyamory, how it's distinguished from other types of non-monogamy, is that all genders have equal access to partners. So there's historically been non-monogamy throughout time where men only had access to multiple partners and femmes did not have access to multiple partners. So within polyamory, there's this overall sense of values that you try to unpack those kinds of things. So you really try to unpack, like, what does it mean that, you know, I've been taught that my romantic relationship is the most important above all others, unpacking that in that sense, egalitarian, but also like genders having equal access. So for example, let's say someone is polyamorous as a couple, and then they're wanting to date other people as well. They're dating separately, but let's say the couple considers themselves to be the highest priority, right? No matter what. And so egalitarian polyamory says that we might automatically have that response, but it's up to us to unpack couples privilege. For example, for me, I'm married to, like, legally married to my partner that I nest with, I live with. So there's inherently some couples privilege in that, right? Like, our relationship being a legal marriage is seen as more important, right? And we have shared things like shared finances that also give us couples privilege. But as someone who practices egalitarian polyamory, I always try to unpack that and not try to like make that consciously a priority. If my other partner needs me, I'm not going to say, oh no, I live with this partner, therefore I'm going to choose this partner every time because they're my legally married partner. So egalitarian in that sense that you're aware of those power differences that might exist in your relationships, but you're trying to unlearn them and unpack them, and that's a lifelong process. So those are some of the ways I would say considered more egalitarian generally.
Yeah. I mentioned to you when we first spoke, like, polyamory is something I don't know anything about. I'm wondering, what are some misconceptions that are common that you encounter, or maybe some stereotypes that are not right?
Yes, that's a great question. This is actually a bias therapists have as well. So unfortunately, sometimes therapists can cause harm with non-monogamous folk because of this bias. But this idea that you're non-monogamous or you're polyamorous because something is wrong. Either something's wrong with you, something's wrong with your relationship, like you're not satisfied. In psychology, we call it pathologizing, like assuming that there's something mentally ill about this, something that is unhealthy. So that is a really big misperception, and it's not borne out by research. So what we do know is, like, polyamorous folk give the same ratings of relationship satisfaction, trust, love as their monogamous counterparts. Sometimes even give higher ratings for certain things, like for communication, just because in polyamory, you just have to have a lot of communication. I feel like if you're going to sustain it, because everybody decides what their own boundaries are and everything. So it's not like there's a template. You just go with what makes you feel safe, what liberates you. So yeah, that's a big one. Let's see, what are some other ones? I think, like, for example, like, I have a female partner that is comfortable being out. And I think sometimes, especially within the Iranian community, this idea that your poor husband, oh, poor guy, like, he's just staying at home and you are just going and just doing whatever with your lady friend. Again, there's this sexism to, like, the same people I've seen react in a much less harsher way, actually not in a harsh way at all, when it was a man who was cheating. There's this assumption of morality that somehow non-monogamous people are less moral. That just isn't true. People think that you're very sexually risky. Actually, research shows the opposite, that if you are ethically non-monogamous, so like you're being open about it, you use safer sex practices than someone who is unethically non-monogamous. So someone who's cheating actually uses less safe sex practices. So that's another common one. Sometimes polyamorous people can be fetishized, like, oh, you're having sex all the time and that's all it's about. It's just about sex. And okay, that's not true. Especially for BIPOC, a lot of us, it's about family and it's about community and it's about unlearning aspects of white supremacy culture, of capitalism that have shown up in our relationships, these ideas of ownership that we've sort of internalized, unpacking all those things. And so a lot of us practice it from a decolonized way, a very, again, egalitarian, but trying to decolonize what we know about love. So that is something that a lot of polyamorous people, I think, commit to. But again, broad spectrum, so not everybody. But I see that perspective generally more within the polyamorous community than in other communities I've seen.
Yeah. Last time we talked, I asked you if you thought it was like sexual orientation where you either are or are not. And you said sometimes, right? Do you want to talk a little bit about that? Because for me personally, I'm definitely monogamous. I cannot imagine being poly. Like, that is not something that sounds appealing to me at all, like in any respect. Yeah. So I'm fascinated by this. Like, tell me more.
Well, I mean, and that might be part of your identity. Absolutely. Monogamy could very much be part of people's identity as well. Like, that's how they see their relationship. So that's absolutely valid. For me, I think it is so much part of my identity to be polyamorous. It's very consistent with other aspects of my life. I don't necessarily limit other connections in the way that I would in monogamy. So my big value is I want people to be as authentic as they can. And for me, it feels authentic to be polyamorous. And it also feels authentic to give my partners, to allow them that freedom too, because that's consistent with my values. So polyamory is like who I am. And I feel like I feel the same way, like you said, about monogamy. Like, I'm like, well, how? Like, why? Like, I don't understand. But yeah, like, I feel the same way. And it's such a part of my identity. Like, just the pieces I was telling you about, the egalitarian, like, all of that connects to my polyamory, but also other parts of my life. And this idea of just love expanding, that when I love someone and I love someone else, like, that just expands that love. That multiplies my love for my other partner, for other aspects of my life, and expands my passion. It's just so tied to my values of freedom, authenticity, and love, and the expansiveness of love. So for me, it's an identity. Some people consider it like a relational orientation, similar to, like, you would say a sexual orientation, or a romantic orientation. So it's still something that's fixed about you. There are people that are, and sometimes they refer to themselves as ambiamorous. There are people that are okay with either type of relationship. So they can be just as comfortable and safe in a polyamorous relationship as they can in a monogamous relationship. So for them, I assume maybe the way that they might see their polyamory is more like a practice, because they can practice it here like a behavioral practice, right? But in other contexts, they can also be monogamous. So it's not so much like an orientation. There's never anything that's everybody, right? Like, I have to always say that. But there are people that are more fluid, I guess I should say, when it comes to that. And also, people change over time, and that's just anybody. That's just anyone. So I think any of these are subject to change, but non-monogamy is not inherently more unstable than monogamy. Or just like, queerness is not inherently more unstable. People are like, oh, bisexuality is a phase. It's not inherently more stable. Like, I think technically everything in life can evolve, but, it's still just as stable as a structure as monogamy, if that makes sense.
Yeah. I think with polyamory, though, you have the extra complication that our world is set up for partnerships that are two people, right? When it comes to taxes, when it comes to being in a officially recognized union, like, all the things are set up for couples. So there's a lot to navigate there.
Yes, absolutely. There's so much to navigate. It really takes a lot of intention and effort to unpack. If that's something you want to commit to, like unpacking your couple's privilege, it's a lot. I remember when I got married, I was very happy, but I also felt like there was a part of me that was really sad because people were all of a sudden so exalting this relationship and so almost exalting me as a person because I was getting married. And it almost hid my queerness because it made me seem like I was in. So it's like, yes, I'm very happy to be very visible about this love, but I also feel like it hides a little bit about me because my queerness is just as important to me. My polyamory is just as important to me. And for me, it's not the case with everyone. There are definitely bisexual, monogamous people. It's, same as any sexual orientation. Yeah. But for me, they're tied together. Like my bisexuality is tied to my polyamory because I have always liked energy from multiple genders. And that's part of what I love about polyamory is being able to pursue that. But I want to clarify that that's not like an inherent link there.
Yeah, so to close out, I would love to know what you would like listeners to take away from this episode.
I guess it doesn't really matter your relationship style. I think what we can be intentional about, though, is thinking about how colonial structures, how capitalism, how these things have affected our relationships. And the beauty of these histories is that it shows us that there are these different pathways, and there have always been these different pathways. And within our own Asian communities, it's so amazing to see. Don't take for granted maybe what you think you know. Be intentional. And there's nothing wrong with, like you're doing, talking to people who are polyamorous just to understand, because that can only help you strengthen your own identity. And so I think it's just be open, try not to have those automatic responses, because you just might learn something that maybe you can take in your relationships. So
yeah, I'm wondering if there's a practice in polyamory that you wish monogamous people would bring into their relationship.
The sexual monogamy and emotional monogamy is very valid and can be very healthy. But I think the toxic monogamy aspects that can come in are like, oh, my partner's not allowed to have friends of this gender. Or, I think those maybe just think about where they come from. Do they still work for you? Because if they work for a relationship and neither person is being harmed or silenced in it, but I think monogamous folk, because there's already like, this is what you're supposed to do, right? So people don't tend to question any aspects of it. The parts that I would question are, the possessiveness, maybe this idea that like one person can fill all your needs, where we don't expect that in any other context. We don't say, oh, well, now I have one child. All my needs are fulfilled, or like I have one friend, so that's fine. I don't need any more. Thinking about love more expansively and connection more expansively. I think that can only enhance your relationship, when you are allowing these multiple ways of loving that are not necessarily romantic or sexual, but you're allowing for that. And that I think helps everyone just be more authentic and feel more loved. So this expansiveness of love and not trying to own it. And, I think the biggest thing is honestly navigating with love, not fear. Anything fear-based, whether it's polyamory, monogamy, whatever, if it's a fear-based rule, I just don't think that's a good strategy for fear. I know as a therapist that that's not healthy. The way that you process your fears is by facing them. So I think try to navigate with love rather than fear, and be open to evolving your perspective sometimes. You can change certain pieces without changing your structure.
Yeah, I had a section about this specifically, but I moved it to another upcoming episode, which is marriages used to be either matrilocal or patrilocal, and the couple would live with extended family. And then eventually we became neolocal, where the couple moves away from both families. And now the couple, they have to satisfy every need of that other person, right? Like the spouse is the entire support network, is all the childcare, is all the emotional support, all of that. So yeah, I will be covering that in an upcoming episode.
Awesome.
But another follow-up question I had was, you mentioned everybody has to communicate better. What are some communication things you've seen in polyamorous relationships that are super healthy that maybe more monogamous people should adopt?
Let's take a step backwards from communication and talk about first, like, we don't really learn strategies or ways to express our emotions. And then when you don't know how to express your emotions, it's really hard to communicate them. We don't even really sometimes know how to identify our emotions. So I think finding ways, it could be therapy, but it could be, other emotional work that someone might do, where you learn, okay, what is this feeling that I'm having in my body? What is going on? Am I sad? Am I disappointed? And how does this relate to my partner? Because I think a lot of times when you have feelings about someone, what is our first response? Oh, it's you. You did this, you caused this, right? If they're related to someone, then that's often the assumption that's made. I think for communication, learning to identify what am I feeling right now, and then communicating that with I statements. Like, instead of being like, you made me so angry because you were late again to pick up the kids, which is a valid concern and valid reason to be angry. But instead of being like, you made me so angry and you always do this, and instead just try to be direct and communicate your feelings Like, I feel angry right now because I try to get there on time every time. And it seems like you're not doing that. And I feel angry. And I don't want to blame you right now, but I do feel angry. And, you know, maybe I need to take a walk or like do some self-soothing, and then I can come back and talk about it. So being able to just communicate directly, like not in passive aggressive ways, but using I statements and taking responsibility, like I'm feeling this way, that I think can go a long way, just using I statements. And then I also think we often talk about things when we're super stressed about them, when they have gotten to the point where we're so upset. A different approach could be just scheduling check-ins. Maybe once a month, like just setting aside some time. Neither one of you are hungry or tired. You have to set aside a good time. And you just talk about what's been going on. You do check-ins. In the polyamory community, there's a format for it. It's called Radar, and it's on the Multi-Amory podcast, made a great worksheet. It can be definitely used in monogamous context too. But basically, it's like a lot of different areas of life that could be relevant to a relationship, and talking about them in a calm way instead of, you know, when you're talking about them in conflict, which you don't really hear each other as much. And, you know,
That's a great point. Scheduling some time to discuss issues before they become bigger issues.
Absolutely.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for doing this episode with me. I will put a link in the show notes to all your socials and your website. Thank you so much for taking the time to do this.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I'm excited.
Thank you all so much for listening to the end. I hope you enjoyed this episode. If you did, feel free to share with your friends, start your own conversations, talk about it, debate it. I want to say a special thanks to Dr. Badie for co-hosting with me today, and thanks to our scholars, Professor Tunsun Wu from the University of Hong Kong, Professor Sachi Schmidt-Hori from Dr. Smith College, and Nilufar Rasuli, doctoral fellow at the Swiss Institute of Technology in Zurich. In episode 6, we will go deeper into how Western influences changed the institution of marriage and love across the Asian continent. But first, we'll talk about gods, sex, and the patriarchy in episode 5. Once again, my name is Lazu, and I will see you in 2 weeks for episode 5, Gods, Sex, and the Patriarchy. See you in 2 weeks.